add a little bit of value from the legal perspective. And so, as you know, I'm a law professor and an attorney, and so I tend to look at these issues from the legal dimension. But first I want to tell you a story. There was a young woman, and she was going to law school, and she was married, but she didn't have children. She did very well in law school and had offers from some of the best firms in her country, and law firms which required a significant amount of work and a very high paycheck. And she accepted the position, but the year before she graduated, she decided, or the semester before, you know, maybe I'm going to do public service instead, because one day I want to have children. And I don't know if I want to live this really intense lifestyle. And my husband and I are happy in the city that we live in, because I would have to move to another city. And she works for the government, and then she has a child. And the job hours are great for being a mother. And eventually she decides, I want a second child, and I really don't like being away from my children a lot. And so she decides, I think I'm going to move near my mother-in-law, and I really just don't want to work anymore. I think I'm going to take a break. I need 5 years. I just really want to spend them with my kids. Life is short. Maybe I'll start my own practice when my kids get a little older. She was very bright, and she got very, very good grades in law school, and again, had opportunities at the best law firms in her country. So I'm just going to stop there, and I'll continue that anecdote towards the end. But just keep that story in mind. So I want to make, so now I'm going to go back to my policy wonkish self, take away a little bit from the storytelling, and just highlight that there's really 3 points I want to make when you talk about the revolution and rule of law. The first is, in terms of changes in the laws, so there's laws and there's constitution. Egypt is a civil law system, so it's primarily statutory. In terms of changes in the laws, there's really very little difference. Primarily because the parliament only lasted 5 or 6 months and really didn't get anything done, and then the Supreme Constitutional Court dissolved it in what I think was a quasi, if not outright, political move. So, in that regard, there's not that much to talk about yet. So if we have this in another year or two, we may have a lot to talk about. But that said, there were proposals from the now dissolved parliament that don't bode well for the future. For example, the divorce law that allows women to get divorced unilaterally, but she gives up some of her rights, especially economic rights. The ban on female genital mutilation, the election law quota for women, and some other aspects that I'll cover in a minute. But just point one, very little changes in the law post-revolution at this point. Number two, the heated disputes on certain constitutional provisions, in my opinion, were more or less a semantical debate about wording, about interpretation. But more or less, if you look at the 1971 Constitution and you look at the post-revolution Constitution, it's not a dramatic change. It's not a revolutionary change. There is change, but the debates we were hearing were really what us in the legal field it's lawyering, it's interpretation, which is normal. That's what law is all about. So, and I'll go into detail about why I think so and how that's not necessarily a comforting observation. And third is, and I think this is probably the most important point I have to make, which is, in my opinion, women's rights pre and post-revolution lie more in culture than they do in law. Because this is a country where laws are not followed, and they're not enforced for various reasons. Some of them are political, and some of them are resource issues. And this is not a gender issue. They're just, the law is there to be manipulated to keep those in power in power. And so I've kind of coined the term rule by law versus rule of law. So it has historically been a rule by law country, not a rule of law country. So that is important for those of us in America who have a law fetish and a court fetish, where we think that's where everything can be solved. which isn't actually true even in the United States. But for us lawyers to continue to make a big paycheck, we have to persuade all of you. Very important. So those who are women's rights advocates really they would be well advised to focus on the public square, on public awareness campaigns, public advocacy, media campaigns, and other strategies that shape cultural norms, rather than overemphasizing the role of law. And I'm not saying they're mutually exclusive. The law is very important and it's prerequisite, but it is no panacea. And it is also important because what's happened with the revolution, as Professor Fahmy had mentioned, shows that there's actually many reasons to be optimistic. I'll go into a little detail. Okay, so point number one, very little changes in the law. But here's a preview to the litany of horrors awaiting Egypt. First, the divorce law, which was passed in 2000 after a lot of advocacy by women in the 90s, essentially allows a woman to petition a judge to divorce, and in exchange give up her dowry. So she has certain rights under Islamic law that she gets a dowry, and that's negotiated. Marriage is really a contract under Islamic law, and so she gives up some of those rights. Not necessarily child custody, it's mainly economic rights. So you gave me $5,000 as dowry, or there's a divorce dowry. If he divorces her, he would have to pay her, say, $10,000, so she would rescind that obligation or relieve him of that. There were parliamentarians in this last parliament who, in March, proposed a law to repeal that. They wanted to take away that right. This is a very important issue for women because what happens in Egypt is you have men who keep women hanging. The relationship has gone bad, usually. It's a situation, the relationship has gone bad, the man decides, and for whatever reason, the man goes and decides, well, I'm going to start a new life, and I'm allowed to have more than one wife. So I'm going to go and I'm going to marry. And I'm going to I'm going to live with my new wife and start a family. And this woman is stuck being his wife. And it's clear that there's no more love in the relationship, and she wants out. Maybe she wants to marry again. Or maybe she just doesn't want to have she doesn't want to be subject to obligations because she is his wife and the financial ties that come with that. Well, he will refuse to divorce her. And I've known many women that are literally trapped and they can't get a divorce. That tends to be that was really what convinced the government to finally pass this law. It wasn't so much about women who were disobedient or women who just wanted to destroy society. It was often the guy left and just left her there, stuck, married to him. And she wanted her divorce dowry too, because she had a right to surmount. So divorce is a really hard-fought achievement by Egyptian women from the 90s. And there are going to be, you should be prepared, there will be attempts to reverse that. Whether it's successful, I don't know. Second is female genital mutilation. That was banned in, I believe, 2008. After much advocacy. I'll tell you the crux of the debate among reasonable people was and I think this was a reasonable argument, although I don't agree with it, there were some women included said if we ban it, it'll go underground and then more women will die. It's better to focus on public education and not make it a legal matter. There was a lot of debate. Ultimately, the ban won, and there are people now who want to reverse it and put in the new law, you can do it so long as it's in a hospital and or with consultation with a doctor. So that is intended purposely to address the concerns of women who would get circumcised by butchers, literally, or the neighbor. And so they say, look, okay, we understand health concerns. But they frame it as a choice. Women should choose. Of course, it's usually a young girl who doesn't have that cognizance. It's the parents. And ironically, the person who was tasked during the first parliament of that effort leading the anti-FGM was a woman of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Gharb. She is not very well liked among Egyptian women of many, including women in the Muslim Brotherhood. But so there is that very common tendency. I used to do employment discrimination law in America, where the defendants were accused of violating women's rights in the workplace, and guess what gender their defense lawyer was? Always a woman. So that's a very common strategy. Okay, second is, so you've got divorce law, FGM. The election law has already been changed, and it looks like it's going to not change in this regard. There used to be a quota. 64 women had to be elected, so there were seats saved for women. This was called the Suzanne Mubarak Law, which, as you can imagine, means it's tainted. So they repealed that one very quickly before the first parliamentary elections, and they said, well, in consolation to the women who are upset about that, we will require every political party to list at least one woman in every party list. The party list could be 10, and you're at the bottom, and there's only one seat available. Tunisia had a different model and said you have to list a woman within the first 2 slots. Consistently, every woman was second. Consistently. But they ended up with 26% of the parliament women because there were some districts where there were 2 or 3 seats available. And that's why you've got 26% as opposed to, say, 50% women with that. And Algeria has 30% in the parliament, interestingly, although I think they've got a quota. So that's gone, and as a result, you had 11 women within both the People's Assembly and the Shura. So you went from 64 to 11. And that's not going to change because the new election law, they tried to make it where you had to put a woman in the first half of your party list, which, by the way, doesn't change anything, because there's only usually 2, maybe 3 seats available, and usually the list is quite lengthy. So that's gone, and unfortunately they were able to succeed because it was anything that's the Suzanne Mubarak, that's what the FGM law is, the Suzanne Mubarak law. That's what Khola, which is the divorce law, Suzanne Mubarak law. So there's a lot of abuse of they're manipulating the hatred for the old regime in order to take away women's rights. So it's extremely duplicitous. The other thing to look out for is there will be a woman's document that will be issued by Al-Azhar. We don't know. I've been looking for it and I can't find it, but it's in the news, and supposedly Al-Azhar is going to come out with some kind of, I suppose, a report, an issue brief about what they think women's rights should be. So something to look forward to. I'm a bit worried, but we shall see. And Al-Azhar, and I'll talk about that in a minute with the Constitution, now has an advisory role to the Parliament. Not binding. The draft, I think it was Article 4 of the Constitution, was originally drafted to say that Al-Azhar, which is the pinnacle of Sunni Islamic education, it's a very mainstream Sunni educational institution, but it's also very religious, and so it's equivalent to asking the Vatican to approve everything that is passed in the United States. So that didn't succeed. However, it is now an advisory in the Constitution, and so there's a big debate as to what does that mean. Okay, so now moving to the Constitution. So my thesis is, look, there's not really that much change, but there could be a lot of change. So the 2 main issues that conceptually are really where the rubber hit the ground on women's issues was whether the new Constitution solidified and entrenched the role of women as a mother and wife first, and then maybe as someone who works, such that future legislation that gave women more rights could be struck down as unconstitutional because it violates the provision that says a woman's primary role is in the home. And there's many provisions that, some of it's a little more explicit than others, some of it's implicit, but it's repeated, and I'll go over these provisions very quickly in a minute. So that's the first. The second, it did not set a floor on a lot of contentious issues, unlike, particularly in the issue of marriage, in the old Constitution. So, for example, the old 1971 did have a minimum age of marriage. I believe it was 18. Now there's nothing, so it's silent. There is also no prohibition on female genital mutilation. Now, okay, one could argue that doesn't belong in the Constitution, and frankly, neither does the minimum age of marriage. I mean, just as a legal issue, The Constitution is supposed to be very generic and very general. The problem is when you've got a parliament that you're worried isn't representative, or maybe imposing certain values that aren't representative, you may want to put those in the Constitution to set a floor. This is the absolute bottom. You can't go beneath this. And there's no anti-discrimination provision that is specific to women. So what they did, and I think, you know, legally I'm not as uncomfortable with this, but there was a big debate about, I think it was originally Article 36, and then it became Article 68, about the role of Sharia with women's rights. So I'll just read you the old provision and tell you why it was controversial and what ended up happening. So this is essentially Article 68. It is not in the Constitution. This was in the draft. It states, the state shall guarantee harmonization between the duties of a woman towards the family and her work in the society, ensuring her equality status with man in fields of political, social, cultural, and economic life without violations of the rules of Islamic jurisprudence. And it was that last clause, without the violation of the rules of Islamic jurisprudence, that was really contentious for a few reasons. One, rules versus principles is very important as a matter of law. So rules is literally opinions as opposed to just the principle of this or the principle of that. You have a lot less to work with rules, and that was not in the prior Constitution. This provision was in Article 11 of the 1971 Constitution, but they wanted, so it became so unwieldy that eventually it just got dropped. Because the liberal / women's rights advocates said this clause, without violation of the rules of Islamic Sharia, is going to make it impossible to meet international standards. They're going to take us back to the 500 AD, and this is unacceptable. The Salafis, and to some extent some of the Brotherhood, because the Brotherhood is more kind of in the middle and starting to far right, but the Salafis are the really far right, said, no, if we take that out, they're going to start passing laws that, for example, bar polygamy, that, for example, require a woman to get the same inheritance, because in Islam a woman gets half the inheritance of a man, based on the system that the man is required by law to support the woman and her family. So it's a complete system of law, which of course that part isn't enforced. She gets half the inheritance, but he is not. The judicial system does not make him provide, and in fact many women work and end up paying for the household when under Islamic law they are not, is prohibited from doing that. So there's a whole double standard there. But so they started scaring the country. Oh, they're going to bring in all these Western feminist ideas and pass all these laws, and it's not, we can't strike it down as unconstitutional. So ultimately it became, it was kind of a tie. They took it out. But instead, we have other nice, lovely provisions. So, let me go through the ones that I think are most important for our purposes here. You've got Article 4. Al-Azhar is an encompassing independent Islamic institution with exclusive autonomy over its own affairs, responsible for preaching Islam, theology, and the Arabic language in Egypt and the world. Now, quote, Al-Azhar senior scholars are to be consulted in matters pertaining to Islamic law. So that's been a big issue, actually, for both the right and the left. The people on the right are really concerned that Al-Azhar is going to get politicized, and they don't want Al-Azhar to have anything to do with law and parliament. They can issue their opinions, and they are an independent university, and people can listen to them or not. But this really connects them with the political system, so there's a lot of concerns from those that you would think would support them. The other side, of course, kind of the more liberal, progressive side, is concerned that Al-Azhar is now going to be able to influence unduly and improperly the parliament when they were not elected. And the parliament should be making decisions based on what the people want and the representatives, not what Al-Azhar tells them. So there is definitely a concern there with the democratic process. And of course, for women, they think, well, Al-Azhar tends to be more conservative. It's not Salafi. Al-Azhar is not Salafi, which is really far right. But there's a concern, what if Al-Azhar becomes Salafi? What if Al-Azhar starts to go farther and farther to the right? And they have so much credibility. So again, it's that loss of influence from your parliamentarians. Article 10. This one is a really important one for the purpose of the issue I asked you, whether the role of the woman is going to be her role as a mother and as a wife is superimposed on her. This is what it says. The family is the basis of the society. That's the first statement. And is founded on religion, morality, and patriotism. The state is keen to preserve the genuine character of the Egyptian family, its cohesion and stability, and to protect its moral values as regulated by law. The state shall ensure maternal and child health services free of charge. That's nice, I like that. And enable the reconciliation between the duties of a woman toward her family and her work. The state shall provide special care and protection to female breadwinners, divorced women, and widows. So obviously there's definitely a patriarchal, paternal theme, a feel to it. But imagine laws that are passed that those on the right don't like. They will argue it violates Article 10 of the Constitution. You want to allow women to live alone? Oh my gosh, that might violate the cohesiveness, the genuine character of the Egyptian family. Women shouldn't live alone without being with their husbands. You want to give women the right to divorce? This is going to devastate society, and they're going to go around divorcing men and becoming loose women. You want to you just think of all the different lifestyle choices that some women may make, which actually aren't that controversial. I mean, some of it, actually living alone as a woman, is a little more controversial in Egypt. So I'd rather pick something that might be more mainstream, such as working, traveling a lot, being in a high-level position that requires going to meetings where there's a lot of men and a lot of publicity. And if you have a very traditional role of women, you might say, this just doesn't work. Or you're on, what are the newscasters now? So there's been a ban, which I actually did not agree with, under Mubarak, which banned women from wearing the headscarf and being newscasters. And I thought that was, frankly, a little too much, because again, it takes away the choice. The concern is that that same authoritarianism is now going to be reversely imposed. And that there is eventually, not yet, and there's starting to be pushes to force women to dress certain ways more and more and more towards very conservative dress, to the extent that then it will be a ban. And so if you were to go and pass legislation that says, I don't want them to be able to do that, Article 10 may become that hook that you can use if you can't get, if, for example, let's say you actually get it through Parliament, which isn't going to happen in the next 5 years, but you may be able not to get it through the Constitutional Court. So you can see there's a lot of room there for controversy. Now, Article 70, and this is when you get into child labor, and there was a big debate about whether there should be an article that prohibits child trafficking, and that, again, about the minimum age of marriage. The child trafficking issue is very important because there's a lot there seems to be a problem. I don't know how bad it is, but it's certainly anecdotally been, there's some agreement on it, is that there are many Gulf men come to Egypt in the summers to vacation, and they have homes, and they tend to practice polygamy much more in the Gulf than in Egypt, primarily because they've got the money to do it. And they will look for very nice, pretty young women who tend to be from poor families, who really need the money, and they'll marry them. And now in their minds they're thinking, well, look, I'm marrying her and I'm giving her a dowry and I got her an apartment, except she might be 13 or 14 and her parents are desperate for the money. And maybe they even convince her that this is good for her. But, I mean, it can be, there's various scenarios you can imagine. But the law, the marriage law, at least if you, assuming people do it anyway, by the way, because like I said, the law there is there to be broken. But at least if you wanted to dispute it, you could in court when you had the minimum age of marriage. Now you don't have that. So that practice, you may find it increasing, especially as the economy continues to tank. And it really is the poor women that get hurt. So just to tell you what it says, Article 70, every child from the moment of birth has the right to a proper name, family care, basic nutrition, shelter, health services, and religious, emotional, and cognitive development. So I read that and I think, I don't think Egypt can afford that, but it's nice to at least say it. Hopefully it's not actionable in court because everybody will be suing the government for violating Article 70. The state shall care and protect the child in the case of the loss of family. The state also safeguards the rights of disabled children and their rehabilitation and integration into society. I think that's very good, at least to recognize the needs of disabled children. but this is problematic. Child labor is prohibited before passing the age of compulsory education. Does anybody know what compulsory education is in Egypt? Primary school. Sixth grade.
Six.
So child labor is anything under the age of what, 12? In jobs that, and it's also prohibited in jobs that are not fit for a child's age, and it's also prohibited such that it prevents the child from continuing education. If you're poor, that's no prohibition. That's just saying, and please keep them in school if you can, but they're not going to. So you are going to, child labor exists in Egypt, but at least now there isn't the coercion of law. And then there is nothing on girls and girls' education. I mean, there's nothing that says that girls don't have the right to education, but there's nothing that explicit, in light of the historical problem and the literacy rates that we saw, it might be a floor you want to put in. It's not in there. So that brings me to kind of my final point on the Constitution, which is there was a removal of women and men in the Constitution. It was replaced with all citizens, which I think facially sounds reasonable. So instead of, it used to be all women have a right against discrimination in the workplace. Women should not, women have equality. There's an explicit reference to women. There's more of that in the 71. In this one, presumably because everybody couldn't get along, and the Constituent Assembly, which by the way only had 7 women out of 100 people, and I think a few of them were Coptic Christians, and the reason I mention that is because the government has always done, well, they'll say, well, there has to be a number of Copts, which is usually woefully underrepresented. It's never the 10% of the population, and they need women. So they'll say, oh, well, there's a Coptic woman. So we got a woman, we got a Copt. So you have even more underrepresentation of women and Coptics. So just be wary of that trick. It happens here, too, in the United States with minorities and women. So I'll just give you some examples. Principle 5 of the preamble says equality and equal opportunity are established for all citizens, men and women, without discrimination or nepotism or preferential treatment in both rights and duties. That's the only place where you have men and women. It's in the preamble, so it's not technically, it's not a provision. Article 6, all citizens are equal in rights and duties. Article 8, the state guarantees the means to achieve justice, equality, and freedom, and is committed to facilitating the channels of social charity and solidarity between the members of society, to ensure the protection of persons and property, and to working toward providing for all citizens. Article 9, the state shall ensure safety, security, and equal opportunities for all citizens without discrimination. Article 33, all citizens are equal before the law. Article 63, work is a right, duty, and honor for every citizen. So that's where I mean, the good news is that as a lawyer, I can work with that. I mean, all citizens is all citizens. Every citizen is every citizen. The concern is the historical backdrop. Is that you can't take law out of society and out of politics and out of history. And so, in some countries, you may need something that explicit. So that is something that will be very interesting to observe. And my final point, before I end my story, is the focus on culture as opposed to law. Because ultimately, based on what I've just told you, the real issue is the who, not the what. As one of my colleagues had insightfully said at a gala that Erla held, Miret Mabruk, who I highly recommend you read her work, she was commenting on the real battle now from the legal perspective isn't so much what's written on paper, it's who's interpreting it. And that's where the progressives and the liberals get very concerned. But that is the nature of law, by the way, and that's why everybody wants the White House. And that's why everybody wants to be majority in the Senate and in Congress, because you get to then be the who. So what should women's advocates do, in my opinion, here and there, but particularly there because that's where it matters? First, they have to develop messages that resonate with the increasing number of women that are working. The middle class in Egypt is becoming like the middle class in America. You can't be middle class on one salary. It's becoming nearly impossible. And in some ways that is a blessing and a curse for women. It's a curse because now you have 2 jobs. Anybody here can relate, I'm sure. And it's a blessing because, one would hope, with your income, you have more power in the home. It's not guaranteed, But over time, if you think about what changed women's rights, it was when the men went to war and the women started working in the factories and said, hey, I've got my own money, I can do what I want with it. Whether they were single or whether they were part of the main breadwinner or they were mutual. So there are more women starting to work. The percentage is about 22%. I think that's low. You know, there's a whole informal sector in Egypt. But I have noticed just within my family and the generations a huge difference that at least the educated women are working. And now they're not working at high paid jobs and they're not working, I think, commensurate with their education and skills. There is workplace discrimination and there is a ceiling, and it's not a glass ceiling, it's a thick ceiling that you can see. So there is still that problem. But the point is they're getting out there and the men can't stop them because the men can't afford to live a middle class life. And that, if you're a savvy lawyer, could be a justification for an exception to Islamic law of inheritance and all of the system of how men get half the inheritance, how men, because for those who don't know, the man is legally obligated under Islamic law to pay all the expenses of the home, and anything the woman earns is hers, literally her property. He would be stealing from her if he made her pay for the electricity. She could go to court under a purely Islamic system and say, I inherited that money, it's all mine. I earned it, it's all mine. If she has a business, all the profits are all hers. However, of course, he can then say, well, don't work. I'll pay for everything. He's not able to do that anymore. So there's some room there. Now, I'm sure my argument would not be accepted by a judge in Egypt, but, you know, I've got to start somewhere. And then also, and so because of that, I think that that's where women's rights should be focused. I think you've got to get into the laws that focus on economic rights. Fair wages. A lot of women are going to care about that now, increasingly so. Employment discrimination. It's really hard to work in Egypt. It's a miserable daily life for men and women. You've got taxis, it's crowded, the traffic is awful, the pollution. You don't want to do all that and then you get paid peanuts when your male counterpart is being paid 3 or 4 times. And you are paying the bills of the house now. It's not play money. The harassment on the street. People need to go to work and they don't want to be harassed and they got to get on the subway. That's not to mention, obviously, the protest and public life. And representation in political bodies. Well, I need someone that'll be my voice to talk about fair wages and employment discrimination and harassment and child care. Which, by the way, I was really pleased to see. I don't think the Egyptian government is going to follow through. But the fact that they said they would pay for child care, I thought, could you please speak to the American government? Because if you want to know what is the biggest problem for American women, working women, it's the cost of child care. Take all your salary. So that then ends me on my story. So this very, very bright law student who quit her job, stayed with her children, she did have her second child, was a friend of mine. And she was not an Egyptian. And she was not a Muslim. She was an American of Anglo descent, European descent, and one of my best friends. And I used to have conversations with her and say, you can't do this, you can't quit. We'd worked so hard. We went to a very good law school. And she said, no, I got my priorities straight. I'll go back. And I thought, but what about the feminist cause? And she says, look, I work 9 to 5, half my salary goes to child care. I see my kids a few hours a day, and I'm usually exhausted. And then I've got chores to do on Saturday. And I would rather live a lower standard of living and be with my children than to kill myself. And I sat there and I thought, so these issues, I could have told that story and perhaps some people in the room, I don't know if you may have suspected it was someone in Egypt, but it's the story of many, many women in my generation in the United States of various ethnic and religious and racial backgrounds. And so I say that to say that these provisions about family and work, although I don't appreciate them being explicit in the Constitution as a legal matter, it is a reality that all women have to face. And as people who are raised in the West, I would strongly advise you against going in there and being very formalistic in how you look at women's rights, and think first about the challenges we have here in a society that has relatively a lot of freedoms for women. Relatively, it's not perfect. And yet we face these challenges. So we need to incorporate that knowledge into our support for Egyptian women in such that we give them recommendations and support that is realistically reflective of their realities that are also our realities. Thank you very much.